The Arizona sun hung like a merciless eye over Tombstone, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of what remained of Miller's stagecoach stop. Ethan Graves McCall guided his horse through the skeletal remains of the building, his weathered face scanning the debris with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen too much and trusted too little. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much, and continue with your story now." At 43, Graves carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd learned that survival meant keeping your mouth shut and your gun ready. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray, caught the morning light as he dismounted, his boots crunching on broken glass and splintered wood. The stagecoach stop had been abandoned for months, a casualty of the railroad's relentless march westward. But something felt wrong. His horse, Thunder, snorted nervously, ears twitching toward the back of the ruined structure. "Easy, boy," Graves murmured, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 at his hip. Years of riding alone had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being screamed danger. A soft whimper drifted from behind a collapsed wall. Graves froze. In his line of work, tracking down rustlers and settling disputes for ranchers who paid well and asked few questions, he'd heard every sound the desert could make. This wasn't a coyote or a wounded animal. This was human. Drawing his weapon, he moved silently around the debris, his spurs muffled against the sand. What he found made his blood run cold. Two children huddled together in the shadow of a broken beam, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces marked with bruises that spoke of recent violence. The girl, maybe 10 years old, had her arms wrapped protectively around a boy who looked to be her twin. Both had the same sandy hair and green eyes, now wide with terror. "Please don't hit," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're already hurt." Graves holstered his gun immediately, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy there, little ones, I'm not going to hurt you." The boy pressed closer to his sister, his lip trembling. "That's what they all say." Something twisted in Graves's chest, a pain he'd buried deep years ago. He crouched down slowly, making himself less threatening. "What are your names?" "I'm Abby," the girl said after a long moment. "This is Eli. We're twins." "Abby and Eli," Graves repeated gently. "I'm Ethan, but folks call me Graves. How long have you been out here?" Abby's eyes darted to her brother before answering. 2 nights, maybe 3. It's hard to remember. 2 nights of fear," Eli added, his voice hollow. Graves felt his jaw tighten. Someone had hurt these children, and badly. The bruises on their faces were fresh, but there were older marks too. Signs of prolonged abuse that made his hands clench into fists. "Where are your folks?" he asked carefully. "Dead," Abby said simply. "Pa died in a mine accident last winter. Ma got sick after that, and she's gone too. We've been staying with Uncle Vernon," Eli added, then immediately looked like he wished he hadn't spoken. Abby shot her brother a warning look. "We don't want to go back there." The fear in their voices told Graves everything he needed to know about Uncle Vernon. He'd seen enough broken children in his travels to recognize the signs of a man who used his fists to solve problems. "Well," Graves said, settling back on his heels, "looks like you won't have to, not if I have anything to say about it." "You'd help us?" Abby asked, disbelief coloring her voice. "Why?" It was a fair question, and one Graves wasn't sure he could answer. Maybe it was the way they held each other, protecting what little they had left. Maybe it was the echo of his own lost family that haunted his dreams. Or maybe he was just tired of riding away from people who needed help. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. He helped them to their feet, noting how they winced with every movement. Whatever had happened during those 2 nights, it had left more than just physical scars. "We need to get you cleaned up and fed," Graves said. "There's a boarding house in town run by a woman named Mrs. Patterson. She's got a kind heart and won't ask too many questions." "What about Uncle Vernon?" Eli asked, his voice small. "He'll come looking for us." "Let him," Graves replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I'd like to have a conversation with your Uncle Vernon." As they walked toward town, Graves noticed how the twins kept looking over their shoulders, jumping at every sound. Whatever had happened to them had left them expecting violence at every turn. "Tell me about these 2 nights," Graves said gently as they reached the outskirts of Tombstone. Abby and Eli exchanged another look, one of those twin communications that needed no words, but Graves caught something in that glance, a flicker of, what? Fear? Guilt? Secrets? "We ran away," Abby said finally. "Uncle Vernon he was angry about something. Said we knew where Pa hid something valuable before he died. But we don't know nothing about that," Eli added quickly. "Pa never told us about hiding anything." Graves filed that information away. A hidden treasure, an angry uncle, and 2 traumatized children. The pieces of a larger puzzle were starting to form, and he had a feeling the picture they'd reveal wouldn't be pretty. As they entered Tombstone's main street, Graves noticed how people stared, some with curiosity, others with what looked like recognition. A few shopkeepers quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in their merchandise. "Folks know you here?" Graves asked. "Some," Abby admitted. "We used to come to town with Ma sometimes before she got sick." But the looks they were getting weren't the sympathetic glances usually reserved for orphaned children. There was something else there. Fear, maybe even guilt. At the boarding house, Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with kind eyes and graying hair, took one look at the twins and ushered them inside without question. But even she seemed nervous, glancing up and down the street before closing the door. "You sure about this, Mr. McCall?" she asked quietly. "There's been talk." "What kind of talk?" Mrs. Patterson wrung her hands. "About the Walker children. Some say they're cursed. That trouble follows them wherever they go." Graves felt his temper flare. "They're just scared kids who've been hurt." "I know that," Mrs. Patterson said quickly. "But Vernon Walker's been asking questions, making threats. And after what happened to their parents? What about their parents?" The boarding house keeper glanced toward the room where Abby and Eli were getting cleaned up. "Maybe that's a conversation for another time." As evening fell, Graves sat on the boarding house porch, watching the street. The twins were safe for now, fed and sleeping in clean beds. But he could feel eyes on him from the shadows, and he knew their troubles were far from over. A figure emerged from the saloon across the street, a tall, thin man with cruel eyes and hands that looked like they'd done their share of violence. Even in the dim light, Graves could see the family resemblance to the twins. Uncle Vernon had come to town. The man's gaze found Graves on the porch, and for a long moment they stared at each other across the dusty street. Then Vernon smiled, a cold, calculating expression that promised trouble. Graves touched the grip of his gun and smiled back. "Let him come." Some conversations were best had with iron backing up your words. As Vernon disappeared back into the saloon, Graves settled in for a long night of watching. The twins had whispered about 2 nights of fear, but he had a feeling their real troubles were just beginning. Dawn broke over Tombstone like a reluctant witness, casting pale light through the boarding house windows where Abby and Eli Walker slept fitfully. Graves had spent the night in a chair by their door, his Colt within easy reach and his eyes on the street below. Vernon Walker had made his presence known, but he hadn't made his move. Yet. The twins woke with the sun, their eyes immediately scanning the room for threats before settling on Graves's reassuring presence. "Morning," he said softly. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than we have in weeks," Abby admitted, though the dark circles under her eyes suggested sleep hadn't come easily. Eli sat up slowly, wincing. "Is Uncle Vernon still out there?" "He's around," Graves said honestly, "but he won't try anything in broad daylight. Too many witnesses." Mrs. Patterson brought breakfast, eggs, bacon, and fresh bread that the twins devoured like they hadn't eaten in days. Probably hadn't, Graves realized, watching them eat. "We need to talk to Marshal Whitman," Graves said as they finished eating. "Get this situation official." The twins exchanged that look again, the one that made Graves's instincts prickle with unease. "The marshal won't help," Abby said quietly. "Why not?" He's friends with Uncle Vernon, Eli explained. They drink together at the saloon. Graves felt his jaw tighten. A corrupt lawman made everything more complicated. But he'd dealt with worse odds before. Then we'll handle this ourselves, he said. But first, I need to know more about what happened to your parents. Mrs. Patterson mentioned something last night. The twins grew quiet, their food suddenly forgotten. Pa died in the Silver Queen mine, Abby said finally. Cave-in. But what? Some folks said it wasn't an accident, Eli whispered. Said someone might have caused it. Who would want to hurt your father? Another exchange of glances. These children were keeping secrets, and Graves was beginning to understand that their safety might depend on uncovering them. Pa found something in the mine, Abby said reluctantly. Something valuable. He told Ma about it the night before he died, but he never told us what it was. And your Uncle Vernon thinks you know where it is? He keeps asking us, Eli said, his voice trembling. He gets real angry when we say we don't know. That's why we ran away. Graves leaned forward. Tell me about those 2 nights. What exactly happened? The twins looked at each other, and Graves saw fear flicker across their faces, but also something else. Guilt? Shame. We can't, Abby whispered. We promised. Promised who? Each other, Eli said. We promised we'd never tell anyone what we saw. Before Graves could press further, the sound of heavy boots on the boarding house stairs made everyone freeze. Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted up from below, nervous and apologetic. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, but I can't let you disturb my guests. Those ain't your guests, woman. They're my kin, and I'm taking them home. Vernon Walker's voice was rough with alcohol and anger. Graves was on his feet instantly, his hand on his gun. Stay here, he told the twins, then stepped out onto the landing. Vernon Walker stood at the bottom of the stairs, a big man gone soft around the middle but still dangerous. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of whiskey and unwashed clothes. 2 other men flanked him, hired muscle by the look of them. Mr. Walker, Graves said calmly, descending the stairs. I'm Ethan McCall. I believe we need to talk. Nothing to talk about, stranger. I'm here for my nephew and niece. The children don't want to go with you. Vernon's laugh was ugly. Don't matter what they want. They're mine by law, and I got papers to prove it. He pulled a folded document from his coat, guardianship papers that looked official enough, though Graves suspected they'd been obtained through less than honest means. Even if those papers are legitimate, Graves said, the children have the right to be safe, and from the looks of their bruises, they haven't been. How I discipline my kin ain't your concern. It is now. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. Vernon's men shifted, hands moving toward their weapons. Mrs. Patterson backed away, wringing her hands. You're making a mistake, McCall, Vernon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You don't know what you're getting mixed up in. Those kids, they're trouble. Bad luck follows them everywhere. The only bad luck I see is you. Vernon's face darkened. You think you're some kind of hero? Let me tell you something about heroes in this town. They end up dead, just like the kid's pa. The threat was clear, but Graves didn't flinch. Is that a confession, Walker? That's a warning. Stay out of family business or you'll regret it. Vernon turned to leave, then paused. I'll be back for those kids. With the marshal next time. And when I get them, he let the threat hang in the air before walking out, his men following. Graves waited until they were gone before returning upstairs. The twins were huddled together by the window, having heard every word. He's going to take us back, Eli said, tears streaming down his face. No, he's not, Graves said firmly. I won't let that happen. You don't understand, Abby said desperately. Uncle Vernon, he's not just mean. He's dangerous. And he's got friends, important friends. What kind of friends? The kind that own mines and banks and make people disappear. Graves felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting. This wasn't just about an abusive uncle. This was about something bigger, something worth killing for. Tell me about your father's discovery, he said. What did he find in that mine? The twins looked at each other again, that silent communication passing between them. We think it was gold, Abby said finally. But not just any gold. Pa said it was different. Special somehow. Special how? He said it was marked, Eli added, with symbols. Old symbols that meant something important. Graves felt his blood chill. Marked gold could mean only one thing in this part of Arizona: Apache treasure. Gold that had been stolen from the government during the Indian Wars and hidden away. Gold that men would kill for. Where is this gold now? We don't know, Abby insisted. Pa never told us, but Uncle Vernon thinks we're lying. And the 2 nights you spent hiding? What happened then? The twins grew quiet again, that wall of silence dropping between them and the world. We saw things, Eli whispered finally. Things we weren't supposed to see. What kind of things? People, Abby said. Important people, doing bad things. Before Graves could ask more questions, Mrs. Patterson burst into the room. Mr. McCall, you need to see this. She led them to the window overlooking the main street. Below, Marshal Whitman was talking to Vernon Walker and his men. Even from a distance, Graves could see money changing hands. The marshal's been bought, Mrs. Patterson said unnecessarily. Then we need to leave town, Graves said. Tonight. Where will we go? Abby asked. Somewhere safe. Somewhere we can figure out what really happened to your parents and what you saw during those 2 nights. As if summoned by his words, a new figure appeared on the street below. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit, riding a horse that cost more than most people made in a year. Even from the 2nd floor, Graves could see the authority in his bearing, the way other men deferred to him. Who's that? Graves asked. The twins looked down and went pale. That's Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, Abby whispered. He owns the Silver Queen mine. And half the town, Eli added. Graves watched as Blackwood dismounted and joined the conversation with Vernon and the marshal. Whatever they were discussing, it was serious. And from the way they kept glancing up at the boarding house, it was about the twins. What did you see during those 2 nights? Graves asked urgently. It's important. The twins looked at each other one more time, and Graves saw the moment they made their decision. We saw Mr. Blackwood, Abby said quietly. The night Pa died. He was at the mine. And he wasn't alone, Eli added. Uncle Vernon was with him. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The mine accident that killed their father. Vernon's guardianship of the twins. The marshal's cooperation. It was all connected. And at the center of it was Cornelius Blackwood, and whatever their father had found in that mine. We need to go, Graves said. Now. But even as he spoke, he could see armed men taking positions around the boarding house. They were surrounded, and the net was closing fast. The twins had whispered about 2 nights of fear, but Graves was beginning to understand that their nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The back stairs of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house creaked under their weight as Graves led the twins down through the darkness. Outside, he could hear boots on the wooden sidewalk, Blackwood's men taking their positions. They had maybe minutes before the net closed completely. There's a root cellar behind the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson whispered, pressing a small bag of supplies into Graves's hands. It connects to the old mine tunnel that runs under the town. You can get to the cemetery from there. Graves nodded his thanks. The woman was risking her life to help them, and they all knew it. What about you? Abby asked, her small hand clutching Mrs. Patterson's apron. Don't you worry about me, child. I've been handling bullies longer than you've been alive. They slipped through the kitchen and out the back door just as heavy fists began pounding on the front entrance. The root cellar was exactly where Mrs. Patterson had said, hidden beneath a wooden trapdoor covered with old sacks. Down, Graves whispered, helping the twins into the narrow tunnel below. The passage was barely wide enough for a grown man carved from the rock by miners decades earlier. It smelled of earth and old timber, and Graves had to fight down a surge of claustrophobia as they crawled through the darkness. Behind them, they could hear shouting from the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson's voice raised in indignation, followed by the crash of overturned furniture. Graves gritted his teeth and kept moving. They'd make Blackwood pay for this, but first he had to get the children to safety. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, but finally, they emerged in the old section of Tombstone's cemetery, among weathered headstones and forgotten graves. The irony wasn't lost on Graves. They were hiding among the dead while running from killers. "Now what?" Eli whispered, his voice small in the darkness. "Now we find somewhere safe to hole up while I figure out our next move," Graves replied, scanning the cemetery for threats. "There's an old cabin," Abby said quietly. "About 2 miles north of town. Pa used to take us there sometimes before Ma got sick. It's hidden in a canyon." "Can you find it in the dark?" "Yes." They moved carefully through the cemetery, using the headstones for cover. In the distance, Graves could see torches moving through the streets of Tombstone. Search parties looking for them. Blackwood wasn't taking any chances. The desert beyond the cemetery was a maze of shadows and silence. Graves led Thunder by the reins, the horse's hooves muffled in the sand. The twins walked beside him, their small forms barely visible in the starlight. "Tell me more about what you saw that night," Graves said quietly as they walked. "When your father died." The twins were quiet for so long that Graves thought they wouldn't answer. Then Abby spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't supposed to be there. Pa told us to stay home, but we followed him. We were worried because he'd been acting strange for days." "Strange how?" "Scared," Eli said. "Pa was never scared of anything, but something had him spooked. We hid behind some rocks near the mine entrance," Abby continued. "Pa went inside, but he wasn't alone. Mr. Blackwood was there, and Uncle Vernon, and some other men we didn't recognize." "What happened then?" "They were arguing," Eli said, "about something Pa found. Mr. Blackwood kept saying it belonged to him, but Pa said he found it fair and square. Then we heard the explosion," Abby whispered, and Graves could hear the tears in her voice. "The mine entrance collapsed. Pa was inside." "But that's not all you saw, is it?" The twins stopped walking, and in the starlight, Graves could see the fear on their faces. "After the explosion," Abby said slowly, "we saw Pa crawling out of a different entrance, one we didn't know about. He was hurt bad, but he was alive." Graves felt his blood run cold. "Your father survived the cave-in?" "For a while," Eli said. "But Mr. Blackwood and Uncle Vernon found him. They finished what the explosion started." "You saw them murder your father." "Yes," Abby whispered, "and they saw us watching." The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture of greed and murder that made Graves's stomach turn. No wonder the twins were terrified. They were the only witnesses to a cold-blooded killing. "That's why you ran away," Graves said. "They've been trying to silence you. Uncle Vernon said if we ever told anyone what we saw, he'd make sure we joined Pa in the ground," Eli said, his voice shaking. "But there's more," Abby added. "The night before we ran away, we overheard Uncle Vernon talking to Mr. Blackwood. They think Pa hid whatever he found before he died, and they think we know where." "Do you?" "Maybe," Abby said reluctantly. "Pa used to tell us stories about a special place. Somewhere safe where treasures could be hidden. We thought they were just fairy tales, but now you think they were real?" "The cabin we're going to," Eli said. "It's not just any cabin. Pa built it special, with hiding places." They reached the canyon as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The cabin was exactly as the twins had described, small, weathered, and perfectly hidden in a fold of rock that made it invisible from more than a few yards away. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. Someone had been maintaining it, keeping it ready for use. Graves suspected that someone had been the twins' father. "Show me these hiding places," Graves said. Abby led him to what looked like an ordinary stone in the fireplace, but when she pressed it in a certain way, a section of the hearth swung inward, revealing a small chamber beyond. "Pa showed us this when we were little," she said. "He said it was our secret place." Graves peered into the chamber and saw something that made his heart race. A leather satchel, old but well-preserved, sat in the center of the hidden space. "That wasn't there before," Eli said, his eyes wide. Graves carefully removed the satchel and opened it. Inside were documents, mining claims, maps, and a letter in a familiar handwriting. "That's Pa's writing," Abby said, looking over his shoulder. Graves read the letter aloud. If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. The gold I found in the Silver Queen isn't just any gold. It's part of a Spanish treasure hidden in these mountains over 200 years ago. The symbols on the coins match those in an old map I found in the mine. There's more treasure out there, enough to make a man rich beyond his dreams. But Blackwood knows about it now, and I fear what he might do to get his hands on it. I've hidden the gold and the map where only my children can find them. If something happens to me, they'll need this treasure to start a new life somewhere safe. The gold is hidden where the eagle watches over the sleeping giant. My children will know what that means. Take care of them. They're all I have left in this world. Thomas Walker. Graves looked up to find both twins staring at him with wide eyes. Do you know what he means? Graves asked. About the eagle and the sleeping giant? The twins nodded slowly. There's a rock formation about a mile from here, Abby said. It looks like a giant lying down, and there's an eagle's nest on top. Pa used to take us there for picnics. That's where he hid the treasure, Eli added. Graves felt a surge of hope. With the treasure and the letter as evidence, they might be able to prove Blackwood's guilt and get justice for Thomas Walker's murder. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The sound of horses approaching made them all freeze. They found us, Abby whispered. Graves moved to the window and peered out. At least a dozen riders were approaching the canyon, led by Blackwood himself. Vernon Walker rode beside him, along with Marshal Whitman and several armed men. How did they find us so fast? Eli asked. Doesn't matter, Graves said grimly. What matters is getting you two out of here alive. He grabbed his rifle and checked his ammunition. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but he'd been in worse situations before. The cabin had good sight lines and thick walls. If he could hold them off until dark, they might have a chance to escape. There's another way out, Abby said suddenly. A back entrance Pa built into the canyon wall. It's hidden behind the wood pile. Graves nodded. When the shooting starts, you two take that way out and head for the Eagle Rock. Get the treasure and then keep running. Don't stop until you reach the next town. What about you? Eli asked. I'll hold them off as long as I can, then follow you. It was a lie, and they all knew it. But sometimes lies were kinder than the truth. The riders had reached the canyon entrance. Blackwood's voice echoed off the rock walls, cold and commanding. McCall! Send out the children and we'll let you ride away. You have my word. Graves checked his rifle one more time and settled into position by the window. Your word isn't worth the paper it's printed on, Blackwood, he called back. Then you've chosen your grave, cowboy. The first volley of gunfire splintered the cabin's wooden shutters, sending splinters flying through the air like deadly rain. Graves pressed himself against the wall beside the window, his rifle ready, while the twins huddled near the hidden exit. Go! He shouted over the gunfire. Get to the Eagle Rock! We're not leaving you, Abby cried, tears streaming down her face. You have to! Your father died protecting that treasure. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Another barrage of bullets punched through the cabin walls. Graves could hear Blackwood shouting orders outside, positioning his men to surround the building. They had maybe minutes before the cabin became a death trap. Eli grabbed his sister's hand. He's right, Abby. We have to go. With one last look at Graves, the twins slipped through the hidden exit behind the woodpile. Graves waited until he heard the scrape of the secret panel closing, then turned his attention back to the men trying to kill him. He spotted movement behind a boulder and fired, rewarded by a cry of pain. One down, but too many left. Blackwood's voice carried across the canyon, cold and calculating. Burn them out, Graves cursed under his breath. Fire was the one thing he couldn't fight. He had to buy the twins more time, but the cabin was about to become an inferno. A flaming arrow arced through the air and embedded itself in the wooden roof. Then another. Within minutes, smoke was pouring through the rafters, and Graves could hear the hungry crackle of flames above his head. He fired 3 more shots, then grabbed the leather satchel with Thomas Walker's letter and evidence. If he was going to die, at least the truth would survive. The back wall of the cabin was already burning when Graves found the hidden exit. The twins had left it slightly ajar, and he squeezed through just as the roof began to collapse behind him. The secret passage led through a narrow cleft in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for a man. Graves could hear Blackwood's men shouting as they realized their quarry had escaped, but by then he was already following the twins' trail through the rocks. He found them at the Eagle Rock Formation, a towering spire of red sandstone that did indeed look like a giant lying in eternal sleep. At the top, an eagle's nest perched like a crown, and the great bird itself circled overhead, crying out at the intrusion. "Did you find it?" Graves asked, breathing hard from his climb. Abby pointed to a crevice in the rock, where Eli was carefully extracting a wrapped bundle. "Pa was clever. He hid it where only someone small could reach." Eli emerged with a canvas-wrapped package that clinked with the sound of metal. When they unwrapped it, Graves felt his breath catch. Spanish gold coins, dozens of them, each one marked with symbols that matched those described in Thomas Walker's letter. But more importantly, there was a map, hand-drawn on leather, showing the location of what appeared to be a much larger treasure cache. "This is what your father died for," Graves said grimly, "and what Blackwood killed him to get. Will it be enough?" Abby asked. "To prove what they did? Combined with your testimony and your father's letter, it should be. But first we have to get out of here alive." The sound of horses approaching made them all look up. Blackwood and his men had found their trail. "There's nowhere left to run," Graves said, checking his ammunition. He was down to his last few bullets. "Yes, there is," Eli said suddenly. "The eagle's nest." Graves looked up at the towering rock formation. It was a climb that would challenge an experienced mountaineer, let alone 2 children and a wounded cowboy. "It's too dangerous," he said. "Pa taught us to climb," Abby said. "We've been up there before. There's a cave behind the nest, big enough for all of us. And another way down on the far side," Eli added. "Pa showed us. It leads to the old mining road." Graves looked at the approaching riders, then at the rock face above them. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only chance. "All right," he said, "but I go first. If I fall, you two find another way." The climb was harrowing. The rock was weathered and crumbling, with handholds that threatened to give way at any moment. Graves' wounded shoulder screamed with every movement, but he forced himself upward, testing each grip before trusting it with his weight. Below them, Blackwood's men had reached the base of the formation. Graves could hear Vernon Walker's voice, ugly with rage. "They're up there! Cornelius, we got them trapped!" "Not trapped," Blackwood replied coldly. "Just delayed. They'll have to come down eventually." But Blackwood hadn't counted on the twins' knowledge of their father's secret places. The cave behind the eagle's nest was exactly as they'd described, a natural chamber carved by wind and water over countless years. And at the back, a narrow passage led down through the heart of the rock formation. "Your father was a smart man," Graves said as they caught their breath in the cave. "He planned for everything." "He always said the desert would provide if you knew how to look," Abby replied, her voice thick with emotion. The passage down was treacherous, but it did indeed lead to the old mining road on the far side of the formation. By the time Blackwood's men realized their quarry had escaped again, Graves and the twins were already making their way toward the main road to Tucson. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. As they reached the crossroads, a single rider emerged from behind a boulder. Marshal Whitman sat his horse with his gun drawn, blocking their path. "End of the line," he said. "Mr. Blackwood wants those children back." "They're not going back," Graves said, his hand moving to his gun. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, McCall. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The only thing hard about this is deciding whether to shoot you in the heart or the head." Whitman's eyes narrowed. Big talk for a man with an empty gun. It was a bluff, but a good one. Graves was indeed down to his last bullet, but sometimes one bullet was all you needed. "Tell you what, Marshal," Graves said conversationally. "Why don't you ride back to Blackwood and tell him we've got his treasure map, his murder victim's testimony, and enough evidence to hang him 3 times over. And if he wants to avoid a necktie party, he'd better start running." "You're lying." "Am I?" Graves pulled out Thomas Walker's letter and held it up. "This is a signed confession from a dead man, describing how Cornelius Blackwood murdered him for Spanish gold. Combined with what these children saw, it's enough to bring down your whole corrupt operation. Whitman's confidence wavered. Even if that's true, who's going to believe the word of two orphan kids against a respected businessman? The territorial governor might be interested, Graves said, especially when he learns that some of that Spanish gold originally belonged to the U.S. Army. Stealing government property is a federal crime, Marshal. That means federal marshals, federal judges, and federal prisons. The color drained from Whitman's face. He hadn't known about the government connection, but Graves had seen enough Spanish treasure to recognize military markings on some of the coins. "You're bluffing," Whitman said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Only one way to find out," Graves replied. "But ask yourself this. Is Blackwood's money worth spending the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary?" For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty road. Then Whitman slowly holstered his gun. "This ain't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Graves replied. "It's been over since the moment you decided to help murder an innocent man." Whitman wheeled his horse around and rode back toward Tombstone, leaving Graves and the twins alone on the road. 3 days later, they rode into Tucson with their evidence and their story. The territorial governor, a man named Samuel Crawford, listened to their tale with growing anger. Within a week, federal marshals were on their way to Tombstone with warrants for Cornelius Blackwood, Vernon Walker, and Marshall Whitman. Blackwood tried to run, but the law caught up with him at the Mexican border. Vernon Walker was found dead in his hotel room, apparently by his own hand rather than face justice. Marshall Whitman turned state's evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence, confirming everything the twins had witnessed. The Spanish treasure, when finally recovered from its hiding place in the mountains, was worth more than anyone had imagined. After the government took its share, there was enough left to ensure that Abby and Eli Walker would never want for anything again. Graves used his reward money to buy a small ranch outside Tucson, where the twins could grow up safe and free from the shadows of their past. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you think Pa would be proud of us?" Abby asked one such evening. "I think he'd be proud that you found the courage to tell the truth," Graves replied, "even when it was dangerous." "What about you?" Eli asked. "Are you proud of us?" Graves looked at these two remarkable children who had survived horrors that would have broken grown men, who had found the strength to seek justice for their murdered father, and who had somehow managed to keep their hearts open to hope and love despite everything they'd endured. "More proud than you'll ever know," he said. As the stars came out over the Arizona desert, Graves reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd started as a lonely cowboy with nothing but his horse and his gun. Now he had a family, a home, and a purpose that went beyond mere survival. The twins had whispered about 2 nights of fear, but those nights had led to something beautiful: justice, truth, and the kind of love that made all the pain worthwhile. Some legends, Graves thought, weren't made with bullets after all. They were made with courage, compassion, and the simple decision to stand up for what was right when everyone else turned away. And in the end, that was the only legend that really mattered. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.